Welcome to Brachot Daf 54, Top 10. We're going to be talking about gratitude today. We're going to talk about the gratitude for miracles that happened to us in the past, for our communities, for our families, for our parents, for our teachers. We're talking about blessings, and we're beginning a new chapter in the Gemara of Brachos on page 54. I won't read the entire Mishnah. I'll just say it starts with talking about a place that a miracle has occurred, that there's a special blessing that we make for that. And in addition to that, certain natural phenomena that is powerful, like earthquakes or thunder and lightning, we make a blessing. Shikocho ugvurato male olam. They all start with Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, standard formula and a blessing. Also, majestic mountains and lakes, rivers and oceans. We make a bracha of Osei Bereshis, or actually Osei Maaseh Bereshis. Again, with the preface of the full bracha. Then we get into almost everything I'm just not stopping on because they'll be explained later in the Gemara. Some of them in this year, but most of them in the coming classes in the coming weeks. Then there's a blessing that we make when something good happens to us. It's Hatova HaMeitiv. So if you win the lottery, if you got a big promotion, and the two main criteria of when you make it is it's good for you, and it's also gives you the ability to share it with other people. So it could be simply bringing out a second bottle of good wine, and you're sharing it with other people. That would actually entitle you to make Hatova HaMeitiv. That would be one of the easier ways to make it. And we'll get into those details, as I mentioned later. Let's skip ahead a little bit in the Mishnah. It's a very large Mishnah. And it says the following thing, that in the Beit HaMikdash, because it's at some point it starts talking about the temple, it says Hayomrim ad ha'olam. When they would say certain prayers, they would conclude the blessing with until the world. And then it says Mishakilkulu hatzadukim ba'amru ein olam ela echad. At some point, the Tzadukim, the Sadducees, they said, no, there's only one world. They didn't believe in the world to come. Then Hiskinu shahayu omrim mina olam vada olam. The rabbis instituted that instead of saying mina olam, they would say min ha'olam vada olam, from this world into the next world, to make it clear that we believe in a world to come. So the first teaching is exactly who are these Tzadukim, and what is this belief of theirs that the Mishnah is claiming that they only believe in one world. So up until recently, most people actually understood the Tzadukim from kind of, I'd say, three ways. One, from the Talmud, if they're a yeshiva person. The second, through Josephus, if they did a little bit beyond just Talmud. And the third, from the Old Testament. So let's talk about a couple things that Talmud says and a couple things that Josephus says, and then I want to introduce the Dead Sea Scrolls into the mix. The Talmud says that the Tzadukim were people who basically didn't really believe in the rabbinic interpretation of the biblical law. In addition to them not believing in general, they had a particular issue with something called when would Shavuos fall out. So actually it's Erev Shavuos practically now. And they said, it says in the Torah, it says, Mimachas HaShabbos, Tisru Chamishim Yom, from the day after the Shabbos, you should count 50 days. The rabbis understand that Shabbos doesn't mean literally a Shabbos. It means that the first day of Passover is referred to as a Shabbos, even though it really is not a regular Shabbos. The Tzadukim said no. It had to be that Passover fell out on a certain day of the week, so they could start counting not just based on a random day of the week. and therefore basically they aligned their calendar with days of the month falling out on specific days of the week. And the way they did that was they didn't have a lunar calendar. They just relied on a solar calendar. And this is where things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, or even things like that, come in, where you have the Book of Jubilees, which existed before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but was found also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that talks about a 364-day year. That's a solar calendar. So it would make sense to say that the Tzadukim, that was their calendar. And we find that they would often be vying for power in the Beit HaMikdash. And so they'd fight over the calendar, they'd fight over the power of the temple, and they'd fight over the interpretation or limited interpretation of the biblical law, not wanting to give the rabbis the ability to do what they do and interpret so many verses. So that's a few things in the Talmud. Let's jump from there to Josephus. I'm going to make a bracha. Baruch Atadnei L'Hadem Melech Olam Shehakol Niyeh B'Dvaro. We'll jump to Josephus. And Josephus talks a lot more about the power that the Tzadukim have in the running of the temple, in the Kohanim Gedolim. Not that they were exclusively the Kohanim, but they were often the in power in the Kahuna and at odds with the rabbis. They might have had, according to Josephus, seats in the Sanhedrin where they would literally battle out for power in legislation, and they also had more power often than not with the Roman government. They were also considered to be They were also considered to be aristocratic. They were more elite. They were not necessarily representing the simple people. Not to say they didn't have some people who were regular people, but they were more associated with power and money. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Josephus, and there's a lot more there. I'm not going to get into the New Testament description of that, and I'm also leaving out a lot of details of the Talmud. I'll just say this, that most rabbis, if you ask a rabbi, who are the Tzadukim, they'll say, there's two interpretations of who they are. And the first is kind of what we were saying. They wouldn't really argue per se with what I said, because almost everything I said is already in the Talmud, except for maybe a couple of things that Josephus said that are not said one way or another in the Talmud. But everything else I said it's already in the Talmud, so it's not like a big secret, except that not everyone is fully aware of how different the calendars are. They know there's something different. They don't know that it's a fully different calendar. But what I'd like to the second way is that there were two rabbis who were students of Antignos Ish Socho, and they were Tzadok and Baisus, and those were their names, and they misunderstood something and came to the conclusion that there is no afterlife. And they went out and they became some form of heretics by not believing in the afterlife. So that's a second way. And the question is it possible that those two ways, that when the rabbi said Tzadukim, they actually meant some amalgamation of different groups? It wasn't like, it might be like some Haredi rabbi saying Reform Jews, and he doesn't mean Reform versus conservative. He means anybody who's not Orthodox. So he might even mean left-wing Orthodox is included in Reform to him. So he's saying Reform, and he means everybody who's not Orthodox or main, what he considers right-wing Orthodox or whatever it is. So could be that Tzadukim in the Talmud didn't mean exclusively a narrow group. It could have mean an amalgamation of groups. With that in mind, let's go to some of the latest argumentations about exactly who were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Up until recently, before many Jewish academics got a hold of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the early people who led the early teams were Catholic, and they kind of boosted by talks from Josephus about where the Essenes lived. They speculated that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by the Essenes. The Essenes were an ascetic group of people who didn't marry, and I guess the idea is that the Catholics that resonated with them, and they saw in that text that type of thing. But then came many other academics, including many Jewish academics such as Rachel Elior, and they believed that the teachings of the Dead Sea Scrolls would work better with the Bnei Tzadok, which are what I explained being the version of Tzadukim as having descended from a priestly class. They may not have been only priests, but that's their power base were the priests, starting with one of the Kohanim Gedolim, whose name was Sadok. And what makes it a little more complicated here is, according to the Gemara and Josephus, they all agree that the Tzadukim don't believe in an afterlife. But what's interesting, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a very descriptive discussion about angels and demons and very mystical things in there. So that may be slightly at odds with the simple reading of the Gemara and Josephus. And I'm just bringing that out, that it needs further clarification for the future. It's just something interesting to note. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is the idea that the Mishnah is going to bring out of Eis Lasos La Hashem Hefer Sarasecha, which is there's a time to do for God. You can go break something in the Torah. Let's see, that's a very powerful and dangerous concept. And let's see how it's brought in the Mishnah, and then describe a little bit more in details about one of the most fascinating topics in the Torah. So the Gemara says that after it talks about this kind of change, this takana, in terms of saying mina olam bada olam in response to the Tzadukim, it also mentions that there was they also instituted that when you greet your friend, you should greet them using the name of God. So, for example, you could say shalom. Shalom is one of the names of God. That's how some of the commentaries say you should use the word shalom, like shalom aleichem. So that would be a way of fulfilling this institution. Another way would be in the response, where somebody says, how are you, even though they greeted you, but your response, which is in fact a response to a greeting, would be, Baruch Hashem, I'm good, and how are you? And what's the, and the truth is probably neither of those two is what the Mishnah is referring to. It's referring to something that it'll actually bring a proof text from. Shenemar, it's regarding Boaz. We're going to read about the book of Ruth on Shavuos. And in the book of Ruth, Boaz greets his men in the field. And it says, V'hine Boaz ba mi Beit Lechem v'yomer l'kotzim Hashem imachem. Boaz is traveling. He's coming from Beit Lechem. And he greets the workers in the field. And he says, God be with you. V'yomer lo yivrech Hashem. And they say, may God bless you. So it's kind of like our equivalent of Baruch Hashem, but it doesn't just mean that they responded with God bless you, but he calls out to them and greets them with God be with you. So v'omer Hashem imcha gibor achayil. Then there's another verse, God is with you, mighty man of valor, which is the way an angel greets Gideon. V'omer, and then it brings another verse, which means that V'al tavuz ki zikna imecha, do not shame although your mother be old, which they understood that to mean that when you see a practice like this, it's okay to follow it. There's sometimes we see something, we don't understand its exact halachic ramifications, but it is a minhag, it's a custom, and if it's custom done by serious people, you can follow it based on that. And then here's the kicker. Here's where it gets interesting for me. And it says a time to act for God. They have nullified your law. And Rabbi Nassan explains and interprets, you can nullify the law mishum eis lasas Hashem, when or because it's a time to act for God. So what exactly is going on here? So the simple understanding of what's going on is that usually you're not allowed to just use God's name in vain. It has to be for a very specific reason. So it's allowed in the course of a specific bracha that you're required to make, or the Birchat Hamazon, where the Bible requires you to make a grace after eating certain types of meals, and it's part of the daily Amidah, the Shmon Esrei, and so on. But to just use it in a greeting, which is a casual thing, maybe you're using God's name in vain, and it's not permitted. And they say, well, there's a time to do for God. This is in a way more important than worrying about using God's name in vain. This is how we do things. And Rabbi Nassan adds into that, what does that really mean? If you see that the time calls for you to nullify some strict interpretation of the Torah law, why is that? Because you're doing it for God's sake, not because you're just casually doing it, but you're doing it really because that's what God wants. Then it's okay. So he seems to be refining or explaining the verse in a way that the earlier mention of the verse doesn't quite do. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Let's talk a little bit about this idea. One of the things that the Misnagdim, for example, in the book by Reb Chaim of Volzen, Nefesh HaChaim, and he defends the Misnagdim against the Hasidim, and to some degree he softly goes after the Hasidim. It's not a attack dog book. It's a well-crafted work defending Misnagdim and questioning some elements of Hasidism. And one of the main issues that he challenges Hasidism is in this idea that they can actually take the mantle of this verse, there was at that time a sense that certain Hasidic rabbis were saying, Judaism the way it is, it's not really working. We got to kickstart it. So, for example, when it came to davening, they trampled on the time of tefillah. That tefillah had to be done by a certain time. That you had to have, finished doing the Amidah at a particular time in the morning. So that was one of the I don't want to say many things, but a small number of things, and depending on who's counting, that the Hasidim felt that it was more important to daven with kavana than to be paying attention to your watch to make sure that you're davening at the right time. That is an example of exactly what the Misnagdim were petrified of. They were afraid that the Hasidim would start with davening and would continue in every single sphere. And you have to understand, one of the big challenges in Judaism, as opposed to the dominant religion in which the majority of Jews, not all Jews, Sephardic Jews lived in Islamic countries, but the Ashkenazic Jews lived in Christian countries, in which they knew full well the implications of people saying, let's look at the meaning behind the mitzvah, not the ritualistic, not the halachic, not the performance of the particularities. So they knew full well the consequence of that is not just, it could be Christianity, but it's not Judaism. Whatever it is, you could judge it or not, but Judaism it isn't. So to them, not that Hasidim were on the way to being Christian, but they were on the way to losing their identity with the process of how halacha works, and therefore they'd ultimately be lost. Now, the truth is they were wrong, but there's a valid question to be asked. Were they wrong because they just made a mistake? Or were they wrong because of their opposition, the Hasidim were forced to reckon with the Misnagdim and not just become a bunch of hippies that didn't care at all about, the law? And an even bigger question is, did they kind of ruin the fervor of Hasidism by their insistence that no laws be tampered with, that Hasidism ultimately became more strict in their interpretation of the law than many non-Hasidim? So those are questions. We'll leave them for other people to answer. But let's focus on this one thing. The Nefesh HaChaim explains that basically this is a theoretical concept, and there's nothing really we do with it. He says the last person to really use this concept, other than maybe this Mishnah, is Eliyahu Bahar Carmel. And he persuasively argues the point that it's a theoretical concept. It can't be used. And he does so well. What's the response? What's the Hasidic response to this? Is it, you're right, and we're going to just be like you and even more like you than you are? And that was the response of the majority of Hasidim. And most notably, there was a response to that, whether he was familiar with the Nefesh HaChaim, he probably was, in the Mie Hashiloach. The Mie Hashiloach, one of the things he's responding to, I believe, is responding to this challenge. And he's outlining a number of principles of that you can actually say, you can actually take this concept. First and foremost, he explains that we only have done it in one area. So he wants to concede that the Misnagdim shouldn't worry that the Hasidim are going to literally change all of Judaism because of this concept. And the only thing we've done is we've changed the time of davening. And we've done that because the tzaddik, the seer of Lublin, and his great wisdom understood God's will, that it was time to change the insistent focus on davening times and rather to focus more on kavanah. That was the one change. He only basically says that's one real change. The other changes, he says, are not Hasidim. They're throughout Judaism. In other words, every time a posek goes against a principle of the Torah because of another principle, he's basically seeing what God's will is that allows you to break one principle because of the necessity to adhere to another principle. In other words, isn't alien to Torah. It's part and parcel of the halachic process. So that's point number two. So point number one is, you're right, Hasidim do it, but you only do it one time, so don't get too worried. The second point is that you do it all the time also. You just don't call it that, but that's halacha. That's point number two. Point number three is that if we look in the Torah, there's biblical archetypes such as Yehuda and the Malchus Beis David, that they represent the type of person that's imbued with a special ruach, spirit, to figure out the will of God even when it doesn't go exactly according to the halacha. And he explains many biblical stories with that in mind. So, for example, when we were, I was in 8th grade and 7th grade, and Rabbi Krauss, our teacher in Torah Semis in LA, was teaching us the Gemara Makos, and it has all these stories about Shimshon, and one of the things that Rabbi Krauss taught very much of were the teachings of Reb Tzadok. I don't know if he said them by name, but they were the teachings inspired ultimately by the Ishbitzer that explains when you have these great tzaddikim that do these sins, it's actually because they're on such a high level that God could actually be like communicating with them that it's okay. So that's actually based on the derech of the Mie Hashiloach, and the Mie Hashiloach had many students or students of students, and that influenced to some degree some of the yeshiva world and their understanding of certain seemingly inappropriate things by great people in the time of the Torah, the Tanakh, and so on. Okay, so that was point number 3, is that'll help us understand a lot of parts of Torah better. Point number 4 is that perhaps if we could be honest enough with ourselves, there might be a time where we could that we understand that the halacha generally works with klalim. Klalim means principles, bigger principles. But then there are situations that might call for a distinction in the bigger principle. Let me explain to you how it works, not so much for the Mie Hashiloach's case, but how it works in the world of psak, in the world of rabbinic decisors of figuring out a response or a responsa to somebody asking a question, a halachic question. Somebody comes to a rabbi and asks a halachic question. It has to do with, let's say, kashrut. Does the rabbi look up the Shulchan Aruch? The answer is that the rabbi goes back to the sources of the Shulchan Aruch, also goes back to what's in practice. The Shulchan Aruch is often stricter than it needs to be. It has a certain kind of, it doesn't mean automatically all the time the Shulchan Aruch is stricter than it has to be. But the rabbi, who's a posek, knows what other authorities hold, and he knows what other people practice. And he knows that even within the Shulchan Aruch, there's mechanisms called shasat chak, Hefsid Meruba, like financial loss or the tzarech mitzvah. There's all of these mitigating factors that you take them into account, and there may be room for leniency. So it's why don't we just, every time somebody calls the rabbi should text him or her the halacha and the Shulchan Aruch. First of all, the answer is there is no halacha in the Shulchan Aruch in many contemporary questions, because Shulchan Aruch was written over 400 years ago. But the second answer is because we don't always follow the simple reading of the Shulchan Aruch. There are other factors, there are other halachic works, and even in the Shulchan Aruch, you have to know the source of the Shulchan Aruch to really understand the Shulchan Aruch and how it works. So that would be a halachic manifestation of Eis Lashes Lashem Afer Sarasecha, which I already mentioned. But in addition to the halachic sense of Eis Lashes Lashem Hefer Sarasecha is built into the system, sometimes there's certain rabbis who aren't just going by the simple halacha or even the complicated halacha. They're making a complicated judgment based on an emergency situation. So certain rabbis, for example, they travel on Shabbos to raise money for saving people in the Holocaust. Well, I don't know that that's Eis Lashes LaHashem. It might be simply that they're just helping save people from Pikuach Nefesh. So, again, I'm giving another example. You could see it two ways. Another example is Chabad started these centers, which they would invite people who would drive to shul and drive back. So that seemingly is a problem with halacha. And the answer is they had a halachic workaround that they invite the person before Shabbos, and then they would tell them, why don't you can stay over, and it's their choice. If they don't want to stay over, they'll drive home. It's a free country. But the reality is that the Lubavitcher Rebbe knew this Eis Lashes LaHashem Afer Sarasecha. Another example, according to Shaul Magid, is the Rav's decision to teach women Talmud. He claims that the Rav didn't write a halachic rationale for it, he just did it. And he understands that the Rav thought that this is Eis Lashes LaHashem. This is just a time. I don't know if that's exactly Shaul's argument, But the idea is that even somebody like the Rav says, this is just really what we need right now. He doesn't have, it's look at what's going on in the world. Our young women are going to the Ivy League colleges, but you can't let them study Talmud. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's a bit Hashem. The problem is once you give the power to the person, most people are going to abuse it. And that's still the case. If you tell people, yes, you should follow halacha unless you don't want to because you think you know God's will better, the biggest reason why that's going to fail is because people are full of negiot. Negiot is a word for self-interest that the Mie Hashiloach uses. So we're blinded by our own vantage point. Why do you have so many people that have disagreement over the same thing and one person sees it totally different than the other way? Because they each want to see it in a way that benefits them. So the problem with this concept is in reality we're blinded by our own self-interest. So the Mie Hashiloach has many mechanisms to try to get us to be not as selfish, and if we could work on that, then, and we're truly a tzaddik, then maybe there's something to talk about of some limited application of this Eis Lassos LaHashem Efer Shosecha. That's why some people call the book of the Mie Hashiloach Sefer Shel Tzadikim, where you have to take any of that into your life, you have to be on the level of a true tzaddik, which we're not. So again, he's basically saying it's in some level it is theoretical. He's agreeing that it's not something that everyone can run around using in a simplistic way, but he's teaching methodology so that people have the freedom to think about what it would be like to get to a level where we understand God's will because we've emptied ourselves of our self-interest, and that's a very high level, something to obtain for, whether not to necessarily use it for this principle, but just to a goal to reach. So that's number 2. Number 3 is miracles that we make a special bracha on the place that a miracle happened. So the Gemara actually says the following. How do we know that? It brings a proof from Yisro, and then it continues and says, Anisa de Rab Mevarchinan, Anisa de Yachad lo Mevarchinan. Do we only make a blessing when it's a miracle for the masses, like the children of Israel leaving Egypt, splitting the sea for them, or going through the Jordan River? What about an individual that a miracle happened to him? Do you not make a bracha? Why should we? Because we see that there was a man that was traveling, and a lion pounced on him, and miraculously he was saved, and he came before the sage Rava. And the rabbi told him, anytime you go by that place, make a bracha, Baruch, Atah Hashem, God, etc., who made a miracle for me in this place. That's one story. Another story, Mar, the son of Ravina, he was traveling through a certain valley. He was really thirsty. He felt like he was probably going to die of thirst. And a miracle happened, and a well of water appeared, and he drank, and thank God he was well. And then another miracle, he was traveling in the marketplace of Mechuzah. Mechuzah was a big town, and in Babylonia, and a wild camel attacked him, and he escaped through a hole in the wall that only appeared for him, miraculously appeared for him, that he was able to escape the wrath of this wild camel. So what he would do is when he would come to the first place that the miracle happened, he would make a bracha that it was both for the miracle of the water and the camel. And when he would come to the second place that had the miracle of the camel happened in Mechuzah, he would make a blessing for a miracle that happened with the camel and mention Aravot, the miracle of the water that he found. So the Gemara responds, you're right. You do make a blessing, in fact, on a personal miracle, but if it's a public miracle, everybody is obligated to make a blessing. A private miracle, only the person who the miracle happened to, and then eventually the rabbis, the commentators say, their children, their descendants, or a teacher of a Rebbe Muvak, of a serious teacher, a student of a serious teacher, can also make the bracha in that place that the miracle occurred. So let's talk a moment about this and basically acknowledge that, we were talking about Hasidim before, that many Hasidim have, for example, a Yontif on Yud-Tes Kislev. What happened on Yud-Tes Kislev? The first Chabad Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, was freed from the Tsarist prison where he almost was sentenced to death, God forbid. So up until today, Chabad Hasidim make a Sudas Ha'odah. They make a festive meal of thanksgiving. And again, they don't make a bracha on it. They're not in the place where the miracle happened per se, but they do its equivalent. Okay? Now, I wanted to mention that would you make a bracha if you were saved by, somebody, a bandit came, pointed his gun at you, threatened to kill you, and then didn't? Is that a miracle that will require, you feel like it's a miracle, but the post can say you don't make a bracha on that. You would make a hagomel, and we'll talk about what a hagomel is later, but you wouldn't make a bracha and a nes. But many authorities say you do make a bracha on a wild beast. What's the difference? I was thinking, what's the difference, being attacked by a lion or being attacked by a human being? So the answer might be that the human being ultimately has bechira, like he could choose to not hurt you. So even though he attacked you, he threatened to hurt you, every moment is a new moment. So it's almost like he decided not to kill you for whatever reason, either because he got scared or he grew conscious. Fine. So you don't. On some level, you're grateful, but it's the lion that attacks you and you escape from the lion. That's a natural phenomena. That the lion doesn't have a conscience. The lion attacks you, wants to kill you because you're either our prey because you're in its area, you're threatening it, or your food, whichever one it is, it's going to kill you. If it didn't kill you, that we consider a miracle because it's not like lions generally are known to change their mind. Although I'm not a zoologist, so you can maybe lions. This guy doesn't have enough fat to satisfy my pride. I'm going to move on. But that would be the miracle. Okay, so that's number 3. Number 4 is we're going to talk about specific miracles. And this is interesting about giants and the spear of Moses, the walls of Jericho. So let's take a look at this. This is a little bit closer to the bottom of 54a. So if you see the crossing of the Red Sea, or the place of the crossing of the Jordan, or the canyons of Arnon, or Abnei al-Gavish, the stones of Al-Gavish, or the stone that Og, the king of Bashan, wanted to throw at Israel, or the stone that Moses sat upon when Joshua waged war against Amalek, or the Chomat Yericho, the walls of Jericho that fell, or the wife of Lot. More on that later. On all of those things, you have to give praise and acknowledgement before God. This is a brisa that fleshes out the teaching of the Mishnah about a makam she'asa bo'nes, or shenasa bo'nisim, a place of miracles occurred. So the Gemara says, what exactly is this crossing of the canyon of Arnon? And there's a story the Gemara tells us that there was a very narrow canyon, and our enemies, the Amorites, hid in the clefts of the canyon, and we had to go through the canyon. They were waiting in ambush, and they were going to just, while we were in the middle, they were going to attack us, block us from going forward or back, and just massacre us at that point. And this would have happened if not for a miracle, that when the Jews traveled in the desert, the Ark of the Covenant leveled the mountains before them. So because of that, when the Ark of the Covenant came to the Canyon of Arnon, the mountains came together and killed the Amorites that were hiding in those caves. So we were able to just cross, but their blood flowed between the mountains, and there were these two. The Jews were not aware of this miracle. Only these two Mitzrayim, these two lepers, who were trailing behind, saw the blood, and they told us. They informed the rest of us. And that was we sang shira, we sang songs of praise. So that's the story to that. And let's do a little more here. Let's do the story of Og, the stone that Og, the king of Bashan, wanted to throw upon Israel. So there was according to the tradition, the camp of the Israelites were 3 parsos square. Okay, so a parsa is approximately just under 3 miles, let's say. So he uprooted a mountain that was 3 parsas square, and he intended to throw it on us and kill us all. And he was carrying it over his head. That's how you carry heavy things. And the Holy One, blessed be He, brought ants into the mountain. They bore a hole through it, and it fell on his neck. And he wanted to remove it from around his neck, and then his teeth extended downward at either side, so he couldn't remove it. Now, let's talk a little bit about what this might mean. What are the this besides for a simple reading and a literal level, there's also got to be some deeper meaning into some of these details. So I was thinking the following: Og Melech HaBashan, what his schut, his merit, was that he was the one who informed, he did some favors for Abraham. So because he did these things many, many hundreds of years earlier for Abraham and Sarah, he had a special schut, he had a special merit. So what that represents is somebody who thinks that in the power of his what he's done in the past, that enables him to do whatever he wants, and take this giant stone. It gives him the strength to take a giant stone and drop it on other people, because they're little people, because he's, after all, this big deal. Now, what does God send specifically? He doesn't send a bigger creature. He sends ants. He sends some of the smallest creatures and say, you know why ants will win? Because they work together. No matter how small they are, they can work together, and they cause the rock, his kind of strength, to crumble, because his strength was about really being alone and against, using the power that he had against other people, not for other people. And the ants exposed his weakness, and then it fell around his head. He tried to remove it, but his teeth grew out, so to speak, so he couldn't He couldn't remove it. Teeth represent things that grow, and he never really grew out of where he was. He did this one thing at the time of Abraham and Sarah, and he never was able to go back on track to do the right thing again. So he says, okay, fine. So your growth, your growth is a physical growth. You were given great strength because you did this one mitzvah in your lifetime, and you kept growing. But now we're going to give you a taste of that. Your teeth grow, and that'll put this thing around your neck that you can't take it off. That's a little interpretation of that story. That's number 3. Number 4. No, that was number 4. Number 5 is the bracha for the wife of Lot. So the Gemara says, fine, all these places associated with miracles, which, by the way, we don't really know where they are. So if somebody says this is this place, we don't know that, so we could say it without Shem Malchus, without saying God's name. We could say the bracha, but without saying God's name, because we don't know that those are the actual places. The Brisa mentioned the Ishto Shel Lot, the wife of Lot. The Gemara asks, Paranusahu. That's a punishment that she looked back and she turned into a pillar of salt. Why would we consider that something great? So the Gemara responds that the Brisa actually means in that instance, you would say Dayan ha'emes, the true judge, which is usually what you say upon a death. The Gemara asks, but that's not the implications of the Brisa. The Brisa says, Hoda v'shvach, praise and thanks. So the Gemara says, add in, the Brisa should say, Alot v'al ishto mevarchim shtayim. Lot and his wife say 2 blessings. On his wife say, Baruch Dayan ha'emet, the true judge, and on Lot say, Baruch zocher es tzadikim. Blessed is the one who remembers the tzadikim. So the question is, who's the tzaddik here? The commentaries say that the tzaddik is actually not so much Lot, but that Lot was rescued because of the schut of Abraham, which is interesting why this Gemara comes right after Og. They both had, Og had a schuyot of doing a favor to Abraham, and Lot had a schut, the merit of being the nephew of Abraham, and Abraham told him, you go to the right, I'll be there on the left. We'll look out for each other. So that's the schut of the tzaddikim, so to speak. And Reb Yochanan says, Afilu b'shas kaso shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. By the way, we're in the middle of 54b, if you're following along, smack in the middle. Even in the time that God is angry at us, He remembers the tzaddikim, like it says, and it was when God destroyed the cities of the plain, and God remembered Abraham, and He sent Lot from amidst the upheaval. This reminds me of a teaching that says, V'hine mitzasi es David Avdi, v'hine bestom. It's something like that. It's actually connected to 53. I found my servant David, and he is in Sodom, which basically means that in some way, the Mashiach has to come through Ruth, has to come through Ammon and Moab, has to come through this story, because there's certain powers that King David needs to embody that has to take even the harsh measures that Ammon and Moab represent. And that's again in time for Shavuos. Okay, that's number 5. Number 6 is air travel and Hagomel. This is a fascinating Gemara. The Gemara is, now we're going to talk about the 4 categories in which one states Hagomel, which is going to be 6, 7, 8, and 9 are all going to be details about how we say, when we say Hagomel, and who says Hagomel, and so on. Okay, so number 6 I mentioned is going to be air travel and Hagomel. But let's first become a little bit familiar with the text itself. And the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says that 4 people, or 4 types of people or situations, need to give hodah, need to give gratitude and thanks to God. The first one is Yardei Hayam, those who go into the sea, seafarers. The second one is Holchim Midbarot, those who travel through the deserts or wildernesses. The third is Misha Yecholav Nisrape, somebody who was sick and was healed. And the fourth is Misha Yechavush Bebeisa Asurim Beyatzo, somebody who was in prison and was let out of prison. We're going to talk about these things, what they mean for us today. And it brings a proof text for these things. And this is based also on an earlier obligation when the temple still stood to bring a karban toda, an offering of thanksgiving, when we had something special to give thanks to. Now we have this bracha. So let's talk a little bit about air travel. So there's a debate amongst the halachic authorities, because the whole idea of air travel is, not even 100 years old. How many years have people been doing, not the Wright brothers, but commercial airlines is a relatively new thing. What is it, 70, 80 years old? Whatever it is. Okay, not that old. Commercial, probably even less. But so it's a relatively new question. And so for example, they say Reb Moshe Feinstein says that we learn, it's not simply learned out from the desert, from traveling. It's more similar in a way to being a seafarer, because the problem with being a seafarer is if your vessel breaks, you could, God forbid, be stuck in the middle of the open ocean, and you can't live for very long in the open ocean. It might be, you can die in minutes or hours, very, very quickly. Now, airplane is even worse than that. It may theoretically be safer than being in a car and traversing that same distance, but in the fear factor, the fear when the plane starts to shudder, which they often do, and if something were to happen, the chances of survival, if the plane went down, the chances of survival are minuscule. So that being the case, a lot of these brachos are on your experience. They're not about objective realities as much as subjective realities. So being in a plane is a scarier thing than being in a car, and therefore Moshe says you should make a hagomel when you finish your trip. If you're going somewhere on business and coming back, you don't make it. You can wait till you come back, most opinions say, because you're you're about to travel again in a day or 2 or 3, so that's okay. Rabbi Soloveitchik says that air travel is very safe. In fact, they say at a certain point, what happened is he would come in from Boston to New York to give a shiur in YU and Mariah here on the Upper West Side and so on. He thought you had to make a gomel in the beginning, and then he changed his mind. He said, "This is like no big deal. It's safe. It's not a big deal." But he said, if somebody is petrified, that's another story. If somebody has anxiety, let them. To them, it might be a bigger deal. But for most people, I don't even think he I don't know if he ever made hagomel for a travel. I know he used to say tfilas haderech every time, and then he stops. He may not have even done tfilas haderech. By the way, Sephardim are much more lenient about traveling. When they travel not a great distance, they'll still make a hagomel in theory. In practice, I find the Sephardim in the communities that I've lived in have tended to make a hagomel on traveling on a plane, and the Ashkenazim, maybe they'll make a hagomel on a very big trip, when they go to Israel, but that's about it. They're not making it when they come back from Florida or even California. Okay, so that's a little bit about air travel, and now we're going to go on to number 7. So, some people say it makes a difference if you go over the water. Reb Moshe says that doesn't make a difference per se, because if there's a problem in the plane, first of all, between you and me, the water might be better than crashing into a mountain, but you're not in good shape in any place in a plane if there's real trouble. So number 7 is illness and hospitalization and hagomel. So the Gemara continues and says that somebody who gets ill and recovers, and it brings a proof text for that. Yodel Hashem chasto. You should give thanks to God. Many people say that you don't need to be deathly ill. What is the deathly ill? So there's 2 ways of defining deathly ill. One is anything that you would be violating Shabbos for, because anything that's a pikuach nefesh that puts your life in danger. So the halacha describes many things. We don't really follow what the Shulchan Aruch says in terms of their medicinal understanding. We follow what rabbis and doctors of today would say, and in terms of what's dangerous. But here's an interesting question. On Shabbos or Yom Tov, if there's something that you would go into an emergency room on a weekday, you go on Shabbos also. In other words, if you're not certain what it is, you're feeling ill in a certain way that you feel like this isn't just a regular headache, you're feeling, let's say, a loss of sensation on one side of your body. It might be a serious thing, and if you don't treat it, now that could be a stroke, but it could also be a pinched nerve. If it's a pinched nerve, you wait till Tuesday, whatever. But the point is, what if it isn't a pinched nerve? What if it's a stroke? You could die if you don't treat it. So, or you could get another stroke. Even if you don't die, you'll die earlier than you would if you got it treated right away. Meaning, pikuach nefesh doesn't mean you're going to die on the spot. It can mean you'll die at 75 rather than 80. That's also pikuach nefesh. So a lot of people misunderstand what pikuach nefesh is. It just means a shortening of your life is a pikuach nefesh. When I told that to one doctor, so he said, so then anything basically is pikuach nefesh. Not exactly. So I told him, what are you going to go in for? Now, what if a lot of times you go in for because you don't know what it is, and the doctor comes and says, good news, not life-threatening. Well, here's the question. Since you rushed in and you would have violated the Shabbos, now that you, thank God, we're told that it isn't life-threatening because the doctor diagnosed you after running, 2 days of tests, we're able to tell you, thank God, it wasn't a stroke, it was a pinched nerve. Well, thank God. What do you do now? Do you make a hagomel that it wasn't a stroke? And there's and that's the type of question you get asked as a rabbi, and it's not clear cut that you should or you should not. In a sense, you should not, because it was never life-threatening. But how afraid was the person? If the person was afraid for his life, treated it like a life-threatening thing, it might have been a life-threatening thing, it's worth a shaila, it's worth a question to Arav. And another factor, if the person wasn't deathly ill, but they were sick enough that for 3 days they were out of commission, that also, in other words, it doesn't mean that you have to be deathly ill. You could have been just ill, but ill in a way. So here's another question. Why are not more people saying hagomel after they have COVID? I'm not saying that COVID is life-threatening for a majority of people. The vast majority of people are not life-threatening with COVID. If you were hospitalized with COVID, put on a ventilator, and you got better, absolutely you should say hagomel. But what if you weren't hospitalized? You had a really rough week. In theory, again, subject to conversation, but there's if you feel that you were really sick and you're really grateful, you should probably make hagomel. And I want to give a general psak in the middle of a shir, so ask your own Rav. My friend Eli Schwabel did a beautiful thing after he had COVID, very serious COVID, right in the beginning when COVID hit New York. He made a beautiful song called No Delecha, which is acknowledging, I'm grateful to you, God. And that's really what I want. The main thing here is we're talking a lot of technicalities here. The main thing is about being grateful. And the time that we're the most grateful is when we were vulnerable, when we were sick, when we were traveling and we were scared of our safety, when we were on the open ocean, and there are things that we felt petrified. That very fear and that very illness brings us to be thankful that we are ultimately alive. And that gratitude that permeates this page, that permeates this chapter, that permeates all of Brachot, and that is key to what we need to do in our life. Is all of these things are about having awareness and gratitude for the gifts that we got. That's number 7. Number 8 is showing your gratitude in public. Number 8 is needing 10 people to, or either needing or should ultimately be done. The bracha of Hagomel should be done in front of 10 people. This is, the Gemara continues, this is Abaya says, by the way, Rabbi Yehuda says, what is the bracha? Is Baruch Hashem Hagomel Chayef Tovo Shegmalani Kol Tov. He has some version similar to that, which means God bestows beneficial kindness to those who are maybe a little guilty of something. Now, interesting, why should we feel we're guilty of anything? Well, nobody's perfect. And when we acknowledge God's greatness, we say, maybe I'm not perfect. Maybe on some level I'm guilty of something, but God chose to be kind to me. And Abaya says you need to say it in front of 10 people, and he brings a verse that says, let me exalt him in the assembly of people. According to Mar Zutra, which we don't seem to follow strictly speaking, 2 of them should be Torah scholars. Okay. And why not to have all 10 of them be Torah scholars? Because it says Kal Am, a multitude of people. People are not necessarily scholars. So maybe it means 10 regular people plus 2 scholars. The Rabbi says, the Gemara says, Kasha, it's a question. We don't require more than 10 people, but it's an interesting question. So sometimes the Gemara knows what it wants to say, and even if the proof isn't 100% airtight, and they say, you have a question, but that's it. It is what it is. So let's talk a little bit about this 10 people, because this impacts who's obligated to say Hagomel. Are women obligated to say Hagomel? So the answer is, let's say you look in the Alter Rebbe Shul. There's nowhere in the Gemara that would indicate that women are not obligated. The only thing is you have to understand, it's sociological. A lot of women don't go to shul. They had a lot of kids. Now they have, a lot of people think Orthodoxy is about having a mechitza. There were synagogues that didn't have mechitza that were Orthodox because women never went to shul in certain communities. It's just they didn't do it. So I'm not saying that was right. That's just was their. I'm not judging them for what happened 200 years ago. Okay, so what about women doing the Hagomel? So there's a few opinions. One opinion is brought down actually in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. Probably, I'm sure it preceded him, but the fact is he's still poskin like that. So sometimes we're looking for more contemporary poskim. He's not the most contemporary, but he's a serious halachic authority. He says women should do it. Go to shul and do it. Other authorities say that a woman doesn't go to shul and her husband can do it for her. Or she can do it in front of her husband, or she shouldn't do it at all. So there's these different opinions. And some people say she doesn't have to do it because she doesn't go to minyan, but if she happens to be at a minyan, she can do it. So it's not like she must or she must not. She's given the option to do it. I've seen it become more popular for women to do it. It's no problem to do it. When do we do the Hagama? We do it at the Torah reading. Usually we give the person an aliyah, and after they make the bracha after their aliyah, they say the Berachas Hagama. And everybody responds, Amen, Hagama l'chasam tov, Amish gemacha kol tov, hu gemacha kol tov sela. There's a call and response, everybody responds like that. And if you didn't get an aliyah, you just say it at the end of the Torah reading after Kaddish. And in many communities, women are encouraged to say Hagama from the women's section at some point in the middle of the Torah reading or towards the end of the Torah reading. That's number 8. What about, just to conclude number 8, what if you're in a community that doesn't have a minyan? So you have 2 options. One option is to wait up to 30 days till you can get to a minyan. That's definitely one option. And another option, according to some authorities, is if you don't have a minyan, you can say it without a minyan. Say it with however many people you can have. A side note is that you should give tzedakah, you should try to do something, maybe a Sudas Hodah. If it's a very big miracle, you can make a little Suda for it, or a big Suda. Which leads us to number 9, which is Hagoma for a friend. The Gemara kind of inadvertently mentions something which might be a source for doing the equivalent of Hagoma for a friend of yours. In this case, it's for a teacher, but maybe we can extrapolate also for a friend. What's the story? The Gemara says the following, that Rabbi Yehuda was sick, and then he got better, and he was visited by a number of other rabbis, and they gave him a blessing, and they said, "Blessed is the merciful one," which is a reference to God, "who has given you to us and has not given you to the dust," meaning thank God that you're well and not dead. So he said to them, because of what you said, I don't have to do Hagomel. I don't have to do my own version of Thanksgiving. But, so the Gemara says, but what about the 10? So the answer is, well, they had a minyan there. And what about the fact that he wasn't saying the thanks, they were? I says, no, that's okay, because he answered Amen. So there's a few things here going on here. We learned that if you listen to somebody, it's like you said it. But if you say Amen, it's like really like you said it. It's like you literally said it. So by saying Amen, he wasn't missing out on the fact that he didn't say it. It was as if he said it. Now, what we want to look into is the idea of actually making Hagomel for somebody else. And the answer is that, just like I mentioned that a husband can make it for a wife, a good friend could make it not so much for somebody else, but they can, if you love somebody and they're saved, you can make a Hagomel, not in the place of their Hagomel, but in addition to their Hagomel. Your sense of their being saved, if it really moves you deeply and you love them a lot, just like a close family member or somebody you love a lot, or like a best friend, you can make Hagomel. I don't see people doing that today, but it's a very powerful concept, the idea that you care so much about somebody, that they're being saved from a predicament, from a bad situation, would allow you to make a Hagomel. It's a very beautiful thing. That's number 9. Number 10 is the Gemara says that there are 3 people that need protection. A chasan, a chola, a sick person, a chasan, a groom, and a kala, a bride. And a brisa adds in a woman who's recently given birth, and a mourner, and even a Torah scholar. Now, what are we talking about? Let's stick with the 3: the sick person, the chasan, kala. What are we talking about? A shmira. Shmira literally means a guard, where there's a custom that when there's a bride or groom, that either the day of their wedding or the week after their wedding, or some people do it a few days or the week of their wedding, they're accompanied by somebody when they go outside. What is this all about? So the simple meaning is protecting them from negative energy. Needing to be watched means there are like dark forces that, when there's some, I give you an example. The Gemara says that there's certain times where you're allowed to engage somebody like the first stage of marriage, even at a time when you're not allowed to get married, because Shema Yikadmenu Acher, perhaps somebody else will get them. And the Gemara explains that it's not so much about somebody else getting them, it's about somebody kind of praying that, God forbid, somebody will die. Meaning the jealousy of a jilted lover or potential lover could be so powerful, it puts out like negative energy towards the groom or the bride. That's how I understand it, is that it's not just demonic, it's human jealousy creating an ayin hara, potentially. So we need to show, how do you get out of an ayin hara? One way is to know that there are people beside you, so that protects you from the ayin hara, so to speak. So that's one way of reading it. There's in addition to the negative thing, because we don't necessarily have the same belief in Shadim today. We believe that they existed and that the Baal Shem Tov came and got rid of them all. But we still believe in some of these things are still kind of with us to some extent. There's a positive spin, which is a chassan doma l'melech, a chassan kala, they're like a king and queen. So they need to be given honor. So another element is we give them honor by accompanying them. So that is number 10, and hope you enjoyed and have a happy Shavuos.